What's up, guys? This is Teresa. This is my podcast, and we are inspiring you to look deeper. We cover liberty, freedom, and society. And today we are discussing Christianity and politics. And we have a very special guest. I am so excited to introduce Dr. Christina Crenshaw. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I feel honored.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Crenshaw is a university professor at Baylor in Waco, Texas. And as you guys know, I'm in Fort Worth, so we're not too far away from each other. And I attend a Southern Baptist seminary, and I am very passionate about theology. And Dr. Crenshaw and I ran into each other on Twitter. I was actually covering this topic that we're going to get into right now. And my associate Marcus is actually dropping the links to the trulyfreesociety.com articles into the chat right now so that you guys can go check those out. So what I was reporting on was back in January 20th of this year, 2021, President Biden had an executive order that he released. And the executive order said children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room. All persons should receive equal treatment under the law. And so naturally, this sparked a lot of a controversy online. And Dr. Crenshaw actually tweeted a completely reasonable tweet asking, well, what if I don't want a biological boy in the restroom with my biological daughter? And so I wanted to give you a chance to speak. Dr. Crenshaw, can you kind of tell us about what happened after this and the students' response?
Yeah, absolutely. Teresa, first of all, shout out to Fort Worth. That is my hometown originally. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
No matter how many times I tell this story, and it has been dozens upon dozens, it still strikes me as so absolutely absurd when I unpack it. Because you're right, the tweet was reasonable. The majority of Americans hold this perspective. We don't want to deny anybody civil liberties, and I mean that, so sincerely. But this is one of those, the Equality Act, the expansion of Title IX, where granting civil liberties, supposed civil liberties, can actually really impose on the civil liberties of everybody else. So to kind of recap, it was the end of January, and I would call him a like-minded colleague, a Baptist leader, Dan Darling, tweeted, originally the post that he was concerned about the Mexico City recension policy, which essentially prevented American funding from going overseas to support abortion. And he was concerned about the expansion of Title IX to allow biological men, I mean, biological women as well, but I think the greatest concern is with biological men occupying biological women's spaces. And that is true within education, educational endeavors, and within sports, because, that is also included within K through higher ed education. I think as a mother, as a woman, as an anti-trafficking activist, I saw this and I realized this could pose a lot of danger for the rest of us. I am not as much concerned about the 1%, less than 1% in some states and circles who identify as transgendered. I am more concerned about the the gender fluidity that this then opens the door for. And I had to just express that concern. I commented essentially with what you had, read, and then I just retweeted. I think I even just copy pasted what I said to Dan. I didn't, give I had no idea of knowing this would be the tweet shot around the evangelical world that week. So, it was not anything that I don't still stand by, but it is one of those things that's this has become my magnum opus, so to speak. People are just kind of commenting as a citizen here, not as some sort of an expert. Wasn't meant to even be a hot take. I think that is what has been really concerning too, is that this is considered controversial. Since when? Just since January, since the inauguration? We held different views back in December. So a couple of days go by and people either like it or ignore it, the way that Twitter normally works. And then a student who is part of the LGBTQ group here at Baylor, and Baylor does have a group that's not officially sanctioned on campus, but they are active and they are, I would say, respected by administration, if that makes sense. So they're not actively looking to suppress them or shut them down. They even give them, I think, a space to meet on campus, but they are not part of the campus recognized organizations. And I think therein lies the real problem. There has been a mission, apparently, I have learned for the last 8 years to become a sanctioned campus group. And I think this was part of fodder for their fire. So a student makes a TikTok video about how to report me to Title IX. They start sharing, on all of their different media platforms. Honestly, Teresa, kind of unbeknownst to me for at least a couple of days. Then they start attacking me on Twitter. And I don't know about you, but I just feel like Twitter is like trying to cross a freeway blindfolded. Like I never know how it works or what is going on. I'm just trying not to get hit by a car here. So I opened, and maybe even right away they started responding, but it wasn't for several days before I noticed, like, opened up Twitter and saw, like, wait, whoa, hundreds of replies and retweets and messages, like, really
Wow.
borderline cruel messages. And in the beginning was living in very much of a silo, thinking, okay, did I do something wrong? Am
Yeah.
I the one who's off? Because you're only hearing the loud, sort of progressive, angry voices.
Yeah.
And then from there, probably because Title IX never contacted me, I imagine the adult behind the screen, when they got these reports, thought that's not the way this works. You don't get to report
Yeah.
people to Title IX for criticizing Title IX, which is essentially what the tweet was. It was a criticism of Title IX aimed, I guess, at Biden, like it was aimed at anybody. And they then wrote a student article that was arguably, in my gosh, I guess like 12 years of being associated with Baylor, because I did my PhD there and then I've been teaching there. I would say it's one of the most slanderous things I have ever seen them do. So much so that they did issue an apology several days after writing it, which again, I have never seen them do, because I think they recognized how absolutely biased it was and what a hit piece it was. So the entitled article, which was in the beginning entitled "Dr. Crenshaw Tweets Transphobic Message," so they label me transphobic for expressing concern about gender fluidity in long held sacred places for women. Title IX, 1972, was enacted in order to protect women's spaces. And so this feels like a very anti woman initiative, executive order that Biden has just implemented. So the whole article, because they're really and truly, and I say this in humility, there's not anything else to like dox me for, so to speak. Like I've done a lot of great human rights work with anti-trafficking. I have a great teaching record, have won awards, have publications. I'm a mom. Like I'm a very safe, mainstream person who I think represents Baylor University pretty well. So the whole article could only focus on how, if I'm not willing to wholesale accept this transgender narrative, I then must be unsafe. And if I am unsafe, then who else on campus might be? And we have to expel anybody who will not acquiesce to this narrative.
Yeah.
There's so many ironies in the story, but one of the funniest to me is apparently I was on the LGBTQ safe list. I didn't know there was a list, but I made it. And I think it speaks to like how safe I really am in the classroom. So like quite literally I was on the list on a Monday, but then the article came out on a Tuesday and they took me off. So I'm like,
Wow.
I think that just kind of says more about you guys than it does me, because I am a very safe, loving, reasonable person. I hold a traditional Orthodox Christian worldview on most social issues. I like to back up what I believe in the public square with what I believe theology and scripture is teaching. And I would like to think that my university, as an Orthodox traditional Baptist university, would espouse that same rhetoric. So I think that is what has really struck everybody as disheartening about the situation, because then the story went viral. And I would say by week 2, I felt wildly supported by Baylor University, by most faculty and students, and people outside of Baylor. I had a seminary in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, their president reached out to like express concern. University presidents from other places. I think this went viral because people were looking at Baylor to say, if it is not okay, if it is not safe, so to speak, to espouse this at Baylor University, then what does that mean for the rest of us? So I think Baylor did do the right thing. They didn't come out with like a sexuality stance. Technically, there already is one that supports what I've said. They didn't bring that into conversation, which was surprising, but they did at least issue a statement on my behalf for free speech. So apparently that's rare these days, unfortunately, at universities. So I at least appreciate that. The university.
Yeah. Well, and your comment was absolutely mischaracterized. And when I saw this, because I saw the article that came out labeling you as transphobic, and I about lost it. I was like, this is completely ridiculous. And I did my research. I looked at your Twitter account. I looked at the conversation that you were having. And I even looked into the past at the other tweets. I looked at your CV. I looked at your research. And I'm like, okay, this is just completely off the wall. And I have a degree in journalism from a Texas college. And that was where my head was at too, was like, okay, where is Baylor going to come in? Like, where are they going to support this professor who 100% has every right to share her perspectives, and she's doing it in a respectful way. Not only that, but it is orthodox, and she's coming. And then I went to Baylor and I looked at what Baylor believes and what they espouse, and I was pulling things from their own rhetoric, and I'm thinking in my head, really she should be supported. And so I'm publishing this content, and then sure enough, I just was so excited to see how Baylor handled this, how it gave you guys an opportunity to really have an excellent conversation about civil discourse and the freedom of speech, which are two huge things that I talk about a lot on my channel. And seeing this come into play here with Dr. Nancy Brickhouse, who's the provost, the two of you just encompassing these values and taking the time to really teach the youth about how important it is to engage and be open to civil discourse. Because if we stamp out ideas that are scary to us or that we don't like, it's actually halting us from being able to understand. And what I loved that Dr. Brickhouse said, she said, being exposed to differing views and attempting to learn from one another face to face leads to our own growth in individuals and academic institution. And you said a dissenting opinion does not constitute hate speech. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, so yeah, Teresa, just want to reiterate, really thankful that the provost came out with that, because what that then does is it protects anybody else, any other faculty, students as well, but particularly I think this was meant, for faculty free speech expression. It sets the precedence. I think, Fox News interviewed me and they said, this isn't Berkeley, this is Baylor. Were you surprised? And I said, I think that we all were a little blindsided, and we can talk more about this and unpack it later, but I think it does speak to where our culture is now, that this isn't just happening at more progressive schools like Berkeley, that it's also happening at Christian schools like Baylor. But yes, it's the free speech issue. I don't even know that that was really it's something that I've been aware of. I teach English, I teach education courses. Certainly I understand navigating these sorts of difficult, sensitive conversations with nuance and respectfully coming to the table with different perspectives, finding common ground. Status is one of the places we talk about finding that point of common interest. Where's their dissent, but where can we find common ground? So I have thought long and hard about the rhetoric that we use and the conversations that we have, but I can't say that until this incident that I was actually worried about whether or not our free speech was protected. And so some different outlets have said, oh, well, that was really naive of you. And on the one hand, perhaps, but I'm in like these circles that have more or less been moderate or center right. And I think what is happening is we're seeing a shift with the Biden administration, where it is becoming harder to have a conservative perspective in the public square without being canceled. I mean, really and truly, just since January, how many people can we attest to have been, canceled or persecuted or received some sort of backlash for espousing what was once okay to say in December? And I think, to be fair, some of my more left-leaning friends would say, well, that's how we felt for 4 years. And that then drove me as a professor, as an educator. I looked at the research on this. And Teresa, I've brought this up in different interviews before, but there are actually studies on this. There's one in particular, Harvard study, that I thought was very helpful, that shows that cancel culture does happen on both sides, and particularly if you go back historically. And I think it's fair to say that we see that on the right and the left. Here's what I thought was interesting, what I have found to be true personally, but also what the data supports, is that typically when people who are more left leaning and progressive go after, when to attack something, it's actually a somebody. And the right tends to attack ideas or movements or an organization. So I think and the left apparently does do it slightly more. Like there was some statistical significance to the left doing it more, cancel culture, than the right. So I think it's fair to say both sides do it. The left does it slightly more. And what is different and I think unfair about what more progressive voices are doing is that they'll go after a person. They'll libel, they'll dox, they will go after an actual person, start a petition. I forgot that part. Some students start a petition to get me fired. So, I think that it's pretty rare that we see that coming out of a more conservative perspective. They may cancel Netflix or Disney or take their business and money elsewhere. But this idea of going after a person because you disagree with their speech, and the idea of labeling it hate speech, and then trying to, essentially ruin their career, their livelihood because you disagree with their political or theological perspective. I mean, that really dangerous is the best word I know for that. It's anti-American. It's anti-civil liberties. Yeah, I have just been more aware than ever of the need for civil discourse, civil conversations, and the right to disagree, to just respectfully disagree.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that you and Dr. Brickhouse I'm so proud of you guys because you really handled it so well. And I loved to see what you guys were putting out there. And I know a lot of eyes were on what you guys were saying. And I just really hope and pray in my heart that these students are really taking this to heart, because it was disheartening to see, as a journalist myself, to see an organization attack you like that. And I thought, man, I just really wish that these students would sit down. In the first article I wrote, I think there was a subheader that literally said, students, I think you need to sit down and listen to Dr. Crenshaw. And I feel that. And I was happy to see that conversation take place. And I think where you're in this nexus point of identity politics right now. It's rampant. It's everywhere. And I think it's really fascinating, you as a Christian professor having this opportunity to really dive deeply into what the gospel means in these arenas. And you do such a wonderful job of that. And I have to commend you for that. So I wanted to give you a chance to speak to this. And I do not mean to diminish anyone's experience. I want to level this out as a disclaimer. And my question to you is, how does the gospel interact with these narratives, and in particular, the gender dysphoria narrative?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Teresa. I have never had to wrestle or reconcile my thoughts on this like I have had to the past month. My sort of research expertise has always been within anti-trafficking, within human trafficking prevention, within education, English education. I have taught social issues in education for a number of years. So I have looked at gender dysphoria. I have looked at the way that different school districts are integrating sort of these more, critical theory. I'm not going to label any one critical theory. There are several, but critical theories into education, because that's not really the point of the podcast today. But yeah, so I think that I have had a chance to think about this, and my dissertation actually is on how the Christian worldview equips us to be agents of change. So essentially, how does the gospel equip us to then go do justice? I've always been interested in the intersection of faith and praxis. So in that sense, I've had to think through what specifically about gender dysphoria, or where do I stand on LGBTQ issues. I would encourage your listeners, even if they don't think they're ever going to have any kind of a public platform on this, they are going to have conversations with their neighbors, with their relatives. And so to kind of dig for yourself and to ask yourself, how can I align, faith and sensitive cultural issues that may not perfectly align with what I feel like the gospel is saying. And so I would say specifically on gender dysphoria, the research shows that less than 10% of kids, and 10% is a very generous number. 10% can be, everything from, I'm a boy, but I want to try like pink nail polish, or I'm a girl, but I really want to cut my hair short and don't want to wear dresses. So gender dysphoria can be labeled very broadly, or it can be labeled very narrowly in the sense of, I actually want a gender change, and I want to go through transitioning, which is, kind of the term that they use for changing genders. So gender dysphoria, biggest percentage, about 10% of kids currently will wrestle through that and have to kind of have like a reckoning. Of that 10%, 75 to 80, some studies even say up to 90, but I usually like to go with like the more conservative to be safe number of studies I've read, but 75 to 80% of kids will, respectfully speaking, like outgrow that. They will wrestle through, reconcile their differences in gender, and then land somewhere on a spectrum that we would say looks more like where studies would put male and female under nature and nurture. And I think there's just as much to be said for nature as there is for nurture. But when we look at nature specifically, biological sex, biological sex is a little different than gender. Gender is more of a social construct. I mean, the idea of gender didn't really come into the narrative until, 50, 60, 70 years ago. This was something I started talking about with gender, identity and gender constructs. Before, we really just talked about biological sex. And biological sex really is more of a binary. There are some arguments against that, research will show. And so I think we need to be sensitive and compassionate to that. There are studies that will show, like intersex, for example, but the statistical significance is really small within those studies. Somebody who is truly born, very androgynous, you can't tell their gender, that is a small percentage of people. On the other hand, it falls into more of a gender dysphoria and that is the DSM-5 term. I want to clarify that. That's not what I'm using. It shouldn't be an offensive term. It'll be interesting to see if, the American Psychology Association updates that term in the near future, because that is currently the term used for people wrestling. And so I think as a Christian, multiple perspectives. But I would say first and foremost, it's understanding, it's compassion, it's going low, it's a big macro picture. We live in a fallen world, and that manifests itself in different ways, right? I understand that for some listeners that might feel a little offensive to say that this is part of the fall or that it's sin nature. And so take it off of even just LGBTQ or gender dysphoria, bigger picture. Why is it that people cheat on their taxes, have affairs, don't tithe? I mean, like any moral hangup that we have, why does hunger, homelessness, human trafficking, why do these issues exist? I think the big theological answer for that is it's the fall, and it manifests itself in different ways. So when we have that big macro perspective, it helps us to not feel as shocked, as rocked, as uncomfortable when we realize I have my own junk that I wrestle through. It may not have the same kind of consequences, in the public square, or maybe as controversial, but I've had to work through, sin issues in my life, just like everybody else. So it helps me gain a compassionate perspective. I think specifically with the Baylor students, I've had to remind myself, Teresa, that they are so young. Like I almost said they are children, but in some regard, they are only 9 years older than my 9-year-old, and I look at my 9-year-old and I'm like, I have so much parenting to do in these next 9 years, because no way are you going to be ready, 9 years from now to write an article on a professor that could go viral. Like there's so much development. And I think, applying that to people, even if it's not with age, like spiritual maturity and spiritual growth, like keeping in mind that people are on different places and different journeys with their walk with the Lord. So, just having this compassionate perspective to engage the gospel, and then, having a compassionate perspective for where people are.
Yeah.
But that being said, I have had to go back time and again. I have searched scripture, and I'm asking myself, what I believe about how God created males and females, the purpose for marriage, the purpose for relationships, the purpose for, work and ministry and all the things that we do, unto the glory of God. I need to shore that up in myself. You mentioned being in seminary. I actually am taking seminary classes too. I don't need a fourth degree, but I just really want to know my theology for myself. And so I think encouraging people, believers, to also make sure that they understand their theology, that your theology isn't rocked or radically changed when you encounter these competing narratives, that you're able to more or less transpose the gospel onto them. And like where you see alignment, great. And where if there's not alignment, that's where you just have to say, like, in love, I cannot accept that because my faith tells me that that's not true, whatever the issue.
Yeah, I love how you are aware of taking the conversation out of the narrative and saying this is a sin problem, this is a fallen world. I 100% agree with you. I think it's so important to to deliver that perspective, because I think unfortunately what I see, especially online, is that when you're talking about these particular issues, the whole conversation collapses because people are so offended because either they are trans themselves or identify as trans, or have someone close to them and they think, oh, you're a judgy Christian, you hate me because of it's like, no, that's
Yeah.
completely false. And from my some people
Mhm.
do feel that way, but from what I know, and I hang out with a lot of Christians and I talk about these issues, that's not actually what's happening here. It's a difference in how we perceive and frame and anchor our identity. And I think the what it comes down to is there are so many different ways that we can anchor ourselves too. And what is that? It's holding something or elevating something above just our connection with God, which is like the most sacred, intense thing that we have. But then we're over here in the world anchoring our identity in these other narratives that trap people. I just see them as traps. And so I just love that you spoke to it that way. And I wanted to take a moment actually to speak to progressive Christianity.
Mhm.
Um, so when I hear college age students defending progressive Christianity, which let me just quickly say, one of their tenets is that they believe that following the path and teachings of Jesus can lead to an awareness and experience of the oneness of life. Well, to me, I don't think I've ever heard a college age student even mention the gospel when they're talking about progressive Christianity. And when I read through their 8 tenets, I'm confused because I don't see the gospel in these tenets. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on progressive Christianity, especially related to the environment you're in because you're around college students. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, first, Teresa, I would love after the show, you've got to send me that link and document because I don't know that I've ever read through their 8 tenets. Most of what I associate progressive, Christianity with, and again, that's such a broad term, unless we've got like these 8 tenets to anchor it to. But it's with more of like liberation theology. So I know you've probably studied that. I don't know if all of your listeners have, but I would encourage them, to kind of dig in, like what is liberation theology, or people who consider themselves red letter Christians. Those sorts of terms will help frame what do people who either lean left or who are far left think about this. Here's what I do see. And so again, this is just my own experience. So I've done some reading on what the terms we just talked about. So I have read, but in my own experience with students in the classroom who tend to like lean a little bit, more progressive, they tend to just anchor their theology on this one verse, love your neighbor. And so then it looks like everything looks like tolerating, cultural chaos in the name of loving your neighbor. And when it's appropriate, when I'm having conversations with them, or and if it comes up in teaching, I always remind them that actually the first command is to love the Lord your God and then love your neighbor. Like it's contingent. You can't really love your neighbor well if you're not loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And so I think we forget that. And then we also don't talk enough, so this is where I see a weakness with more progressive thought, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your neighbor is to it's always to point them to truth, but to say, hey, respectfully, lovingly, I disagree. And then to point them to truth, because truth can't negate itself, right? Like truth is love. And we don't talk enough about that on the left. So we're quick to say, love your neighbor, everything, I'm a fan of Christianity Today. I submit to I subscribe to their articles. I use them in my classrooms. I teach, faith and writing. But, I felt like so much of 2020 was like, be respectful, with COVID, love your neighbor, love your neighbor. Everything is love your neighbor. But Mike, can we have a broader conversation about how like sometimes loving our neighbor doesn't look like acquiescing to what they wholesale accepting what they say is true. That sometimes loving our neighbor really looks like pointing them to what scripture says, even if it feels offensive, and I want to be sensitive to that. Like
Yeah.
we in another podcast I talked about how we lived for 3 years next door to two gay married men, and we loved them, we adored them. We didn't necessarily agree on a lot of political and theological points, but we lived life pretty closely. We shared a fence, one that you could like see through. And we would do movie nights in the backyard. We would have them over, for swimming. Our kids played together. And so I think that for me, that was a real picture of, okay, this is what it looks like to love my neighbor well, but it didn't change my theology, like it didn't really change how I interpreted this particular issue, but I felt like we were loving each other well. We found things that we could agree on, and we let that be what we rallied around.
I love that. I love
So
that.
yeah, so I don't know if that answers your
Yeah.
question, but where I see a weakness with more progressive Christianity is that we only camp out on love your neighbor. And we don't talk enough about how we are to love God and to love all of truth, and how that actually is one of the most loving things you can do for your neighbor.
I think it's a beautiful answer, and I think that the research I've done into the different categories and classifications of people in America, the younger generation, the Gen Z generation, they are activists. They want to do, they want to act.
Mhm.
They care a lot about the earth. And one of the tenets of progressive Christianity is that they strive to protect and restore the integrity of our earth. Now, what I find interesting about this, and you mentioned this earlier, is that this doesn't say anything about the sin problem. It doesn't say anything about the fall. And the gospel, which says that the only way to restore integrity to earth is through the saving power of Christ. So my question on this is like, how can we anchor progressive Christianity better to the gospel, or does it just become about what people want to try to do? Because there's a difference between being transformed through Christ and being compelled through the Holy Spirit to do good works through Christ, and then just trying to be a good person. Can you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, and even after, doing a 300-page dissertation on this, that it is still one of those things where it's like, this is a heart motive. Like, it's not something that you can tangibly quantify, I think. And that's hard for me. I like things to be pretty black and white. I like to quantify. I like my frameworks, that sort of thing. But, looking at sitting down with 6 different universities and asking them to look at their mission statement, how are you integrating a Christian worldview in your classroom, and how is that encouraging your students to become agents of change? Now, when I was doing that research, it was 7 years ago. That was really the tail end of the millennials. Gen Z is like just now in college, and so far there aren't a ton of discernible differences, other than they really are more progressive. They spend more time online. I don't know if you're a fan of John Mark Comer. I recommend him. He's a pastor out of Portland, but he has done some great sermons and some great podcasts on like Gen Z and what it means to be progressive being in Portland. And he talks about, and he's written a few books, but he talks about how Gen Z spends so much time online, specifically on their phone, that they're just being discipled by each other on their phone. That I think, gosh, it was like less than like an hour of time that they actually spend in the Bible in a year, but it was like thousands of hours online. I mean, he's got the data on that. He pulled from like Pew Research or Barnett. But I think understanding that like this generation really and truly is, they're kind of just talking at each other. There's not a lot of, and I'm painting, broad generalizations just for the conversation. We can unpack it, or people can go do the research. But there's seems to be more of more of a disrespect for authority within Gen Z that I even saw within millennials. Like this idea of deconstruction, we haven't talked about that, but that really is a big tenet of progressive Christianity. The idea that we're going to deconstruct and we're going to rebuild, and you can see that play out in the public square as well. Like, we're going to deconstruct all things that are traditional. And some things need to go, some things need to be rebuilt, some things need to be reevaluated. Like that is fair. But this sort of like holistic macro narrative of like, we're just going to deconstruct anything that looks like tradition, this disrespect and disregard for the ways that tradition has shaped them is puzzling to me. Like, particularly with Christians, I see a lot of, slander on Twitter for Christian spheres of influence, evangelicals. And I'm thinking to myself, like, do you not know that some of these things you're slandering is the whole reason that you've actually grown up in a pretty healthy home, that you accepted Christ at an early age? Like, can we not give a little bit more respect to the authority? Again, hey, I can name tons of things where I'm like, oh, our elders missed the mark. But just because they missed it in some places doesn't mean they've missed it in all places. And so again, it's part of like that conversation's not really occurring within the younger generation.
Yeah.
For every student I can think of who rushes to be offended or to feel oppressed or to be mad at the perceived oppressor, I can think of a student who is more balanced. So that, I don't want to like wholesale paint them in a negative light. But I can say after, I've been teaching for almost 20 years. Like I graduated college 18 years ago. And so I've been, high school English teacher and I have been a college professor. And so I do now see this trend of students who are just quick to offense and quick to take up the perceived offenses of other people. And it, I think, is creating a greater dichotomy and chasm
Yeah.
between people.
Absolutely. It's like we're imperfect humans interfacing with a perfect gospel and a perfect God. And it can be complicated, especially online. And I just appreciate you and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me today. I've been so excited to get a chance to talk with you. And I know that everyone that follows this channel has been just so excited for this interview. We just love you and thank you for your work, Dr. Crenshaw.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Anytime.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit about how we can get in touch with you? If anyone wants to find your website or anything, just let us know about your social media, please.
Sure. Yeah. There's not much to interact with on my website. It's drchristinacrenshaw.com. Funny enough, I'm really not all that active on Twitter. That was another thing somebody pointed out in a podcast. Like when I went back and looked at your tweets, like, I mean, man, like one every couple of weeks, I'm not like this like Twitter person, culture warrior on there. But I am on Twitter, and it is always nice to find solidarity with people. At first, I just had progressive people mad at me and doxing me. But then a lot of support came out, and that is always welcomed. And then mostly I'm active on Instagram. It's a lot of pictures of my kids. So I don't know. It's a lot of pictures of my kids, but I have been talking about cultural engagement and the difference between biblical justice and social justice, which we had talked about. On Instagram for a while. Like you can go back and see years of this. So if you're interested in those topics, I'd love to meet people through that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Christina Crenshaw. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to jump down in the comment section. Let me know and let me know your thoughts on this stream. If there are any topics that came up today that you want to see more of, please let us know and follow us at trulyfreesociety.com. Bye, guys.